So again, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening and good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Olenka Pevny, and I am the University Lecturer in Slavonic Studies at the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics. I always forget the linguistics at the University of Cambridge, and I am the Director of Cambridge Ukrainian Studies. So today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to an online book discussion of a text entitled The Burden of the Past, History, Memory, and Identity in Contemporary Ukraine. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Cambridge Ukrainian Studies, we're an undergraduate and graduate academic program at the University of Cambridge. And we are dedicated to advancing fresh, innovative approaches to research on the very rich historical, linguistic, and cultural inheritance of Ukraine. And we seek to deepen the understanding of Ukraine in the public global context. So today's event adheres to all these goals. So we are gathered to discuss the contributions of 4 authors to the book, The Burden of the Past, History, Memory, and Identity in Contemporary Ukraine. The book was recently published 2020 by Indiana University Press, and it is edited by Anna Wylegała and Małgorzata Głowacka-Grajper. Sorry for my pronunciation of the Polish names. And this book addresses the contemporary reshaping of national memory in Ukraine and focuses on a number of very complex decisions facing the country Ukraine in its effort to mitigate the Soviet past and to accommodate the plurality of narratives that comprise Ukraine's history. Well, the editors of the book rationalize its importance by arguing for the quote-unquote exceptionalism of Ukraine in memory studies. I would like to contend that the broader questions raised by this publication are critical for any society seeking to understand its past. Mainly, the burden of the past asks us to consider what do we remember and how do we remember? How do we reconcile collective and individual memory? And finally, who decides and who should decide what is remembered and therefore what type of community and nation is being built? As if these questions weren't difficult enough, in Ukraine, answers to these questions are being sought and being formulated in the context of sweeping social and political changes, in the context of economic crises, and most significantly in the context of a prolonged war that threatens the borders and sovereignty of the Ukrainian state. So the book, The Burden of the Past, History, Memory, and Identity in Contemporary Ukraine is organized into 5 parts. The first part is on the memory of the Holodomor. The second part deals with World War II in Ukrainian memory. The third part deals with heroes and traitors, the creation of a heroic canon. The fourth part traces the loss of multi-ethnicity and the memory of ethnic cleansing. And the fifth part deals with history and politics in the post-Soviet state. In Ukraine, Russia, focuses on Ukraine, Russia, and independence. So we will hear from authors who contributed to 3 of the 5 sections. One of the authors, Anna Wylegała, is also the editor of the book. And in addition to speaking on her research, she'll briefly address the overall intentions of the volume. We will proceed by giving each of the 4 authors approximately 8 minutes to speak on their research, and I have a timer on me. I will introduce each author before they speak, and after the 4 presentations, we'll begin the question and answer session. So I invite our audience to submit questions in written form via the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I encourage you to begin sending questions while the presentations are ongoing. I will begin the Q&A section by posing a question to each of our authors. So, not to take up any more of our time, I will turn to the task at hand and begin my introductions. So it is my pleasure to begin by introducing one of the editors and contributors to The Burden of the Past, Anna Wylegała. Anna is assistant professor in the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, and her research focuses on biographical and collective memory in Poland and Ukraine, as well as on social history of World War II and the early post-war period in both Poland and Ukraine. She has published the monograph Displaced Memories, Remembering and Forgetting in Post-War Poland and Ukraine. And her contribution to The Burden of the Past is entitled Poland and Poles in the Collective Memory of Galician Ukrainians. So I know that you join me in welcoming Anna Wylegała, and I give the floor to Anna.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. As I already told in our informal conversation before the recording started, I'm really glad that technology allows us to meet, let's say so, and to have this discussion on our book. And I thought that using this privilege of being the first one to speak, I will share with you kind of my editorial perspective and start with explaining why we believed with my second co-editor, Małgorzata Głowacka-Grajper, that was still
well
okay.
Done.
Yes, that Ukraine is still worth of working on its links between history, memory, identity, and politics, because somehow politics was not included finally in the title, but it's really important. So I see at least three reasons why Ukraine is so specific and also interesting for me. And the first one is that when we speak about the 20th century, at least past in Ukraine, it means violence. It means a lot of violence. And I would say that even comparing with other countries of the regions, it's much more violence than in the other countries. And that violence also meant that inhabitants of contemporary Ukraine or their ancestors were witnesses, bystanders, victims, and perpetrators, and the roles were shifting. And that became part of the biographical memory, but also collective memory. And that's why it's so interesting even now. The second reason is that, well, it might sound kind of simplifying, but Ukraine is internally diverse. It means not only the regional diversity in terms of geography, but also of the historical experience. And this is not unique for Ukraine, but it also means that these historical experiences are differently assessed by various groups. And also these assessments provoke using and abusing of these competing visions and versions of the past. Another third reason, which is probably the most important now, 6 years after 2014, is that Ukraine is not left alone with its past. And again, that's true for many other countries, and Russia is not the only neighbor that is somehow involved into negotiating and discussing Ukrainian past. Poland is involved, Israel is involved, but the main reason is that Russia is at war with Ukraine, and history is used again and misused many times on many fronts. And this is why history is much more important for Ukraine than for other countries, I would say. So these were three reasons we decided that Ukraine deserves another book on history and memory and politics and identity. And result of our decision is the main idea that is organizing the book, which is the idea of difficult past. Difficult meaning unsolved, problematic, still rising questions, controversies, and problems within the society, between different groups of society, between the authorities and the society, between Ukraine as a state and other countries, neighboring countries mainly, between majority group of ethnic Ukrainians and minority groups of other people living in Ukraine. So this book is about difficult past. This past is usually involving difficult emotions, is involving issues of guilt, responsibility, collaboration, and of historical arguments about the past. And I think that because time is running, I will now proceed to talking briefly about my chapter, which is, as was already said, devoted to the issue of how contemporary inhabitants of Western Ukraine remember Poland and Poles living or present once in Ukraine. And it's important to say that it means that this chapter concerns memory of ordinary people, meaning vernacular memory, biographical memory, neighborly memory. So I'm not involving into discourse analysis, into analyzing the memory politics on the central level. I'm focusing on one small town in Galicia, namely Żowkwa near Lviv, but I also provide some broader context, analyzing some statistical quantitative data. So I'm not focusing just on one small town, but I believe that because that town used to be really typical before the war, what happened there was typical during the war, and now memory in that town also looks quite typical, I would say. So I'm interested in the content of that memory, what is remembered, how the Polish state that used to be there until 1939 is remembered, how the Polish culture is remembered, how the Polish power and Polish domination is remembered, but also what is forgotten, because forgetting is another side of memory, as we know. And also I'm really interested in the transmission of this memory, or lack of this transmission, in its mechanism and how it's always happening. As I already said, this is a case study, and it's based on more than 100 interviews that were conducted by me, but also by some of my Ukrainian colleagues. So this is not Polish project on memory of the Poles, although of course the fact that I'm ethnic Pole played kind of a role during this fieldwork. And I will not try to summarize entire research, but I will just bring 2 or 3 points that seems to me particularly interesting for understanding why this research is important for the broader picture of the links between memory and history and identity and so on in Ukraine. So maybe the first point is that I would say that Polish state is remembered as the oppressor by older people, while the younger people usually tend to say much more about the Polish state as kind of ideal time before the Soviet came, as kind of representative of the high culture, and they tend to idealize and to forget about the obvious suffering and the repressions that their grandparents experienced under the Polish rule. So the younger people are, the more idealistic they are about the interwar Poland. That's the first point that might be interesting. The second one obviously concerns the wartime Polish-Ukrainian conflict in Galicia that was broadly discussed during the fieldwork. And I would say that this conflict is remembered almost absolutely as internal war, as fratricidal conflict between Poles and Ukrainians by the older generation, which means that people who actually experienced that conflict and who stayed in Ukraine, Ukrainians, they tell us the story about Poles shooting Ukrainians and Ukrainians shooting the Poles. And then the younger people are, the more this conflict gets omitted, simplified. I would say that the second generation usually says that, well, something happened, but we don't know much about what bad happened. And among the younger generation, there are quite a few people who didn't even know that anything bad happened to that community and why this community, in fact, ceased to exist in that form. And then the third and last interesting issue is that the post-war deportation of the Poles that happened after 1945 and resulted in the fact that there are nearly no Poles in contemporary Żłobka now. This deportation is tabooed even more than the wartime conflict. And usually people state that while Poles left because they didn't want to live with the Ukrainians and in the Soviet Union anymore, which of course is kind of true, but it's not entirely true. So what's happening with the memory transmission and with the memory mechanism is quite typical for this kind of difficult memory involving guilt and responsibility. We have a lack of transmission between the generations. And also there is no kind of official memory transfer in the schools and via other media. There is also this externalization of guilt, which mainly means that we don't associate ourselves with people who are guilty. So we have this typical mechanism of memory transmission happening in Żałobka concerning this memory of Poles and Poland. And now, in short, why is it important for the broader picture? I would say that this kind of research, and we don't have so many qualitative research on this local memory in Ukraine. It's important because it helps us to understand what stays behind the big data of quantitative analysis, which are so interesting for Ukrainian case. It also helps us to understand why, even though in this quantitative data and research, Polish-Ukrainian relationships seems to be so perfect, we still argue about history, and these historical issues still seem to somehow appear from the middle of nowhere. And I also think that this research shows that this past, this mutual conflicts and this difficult past might still at some point become really problematic once the generation of witnesses is gone and once young people who did not somehow inherit this memory from their grandparents are those who decide about what's happening locally. So I think that that would be enough. Thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Anna. That was perfect timing. So we'll introduce our next speaker now. So our next speaker is Daria Mattingly. And Daria is a Leverhulme Trust Fellow in our section, in the Slavonic section at the University of Cambridge. And at Cambridge, she teaches Soviet history to undergraduate students while also working on her book on the rank and file perpetrators of Holodomor. So Daria earned her PhD at the University of Cambridge, and she provided research for Anne Applebaum's book, The Red Famine. Daria's piece in The Burden of the Past is entitled Idle, Drunk, and Good for Nothing, Cultural Memory of the Rank and File Perpetrators of the 1932-33 Famine in Ukraine. So with this great title, I turn the floor to Daria.
Thank you, Olenka. And that is exactly what my chapter is about. It's in the part on memory of the Holodomor. And I address this stereotype in memory of the rank and file perpetrators of the famine as being depicted as idle, drunk, and good for nothing people, marginalized elements of the village, about women and men who facilitated the famine on the ground. And this chapter is based on my doctoral research, and which is also divided between cultural memory and history, archival evidence, identifiable traces of the rank and file perpetrators of the famine. And just like in this short extract of my thesis, this chapter tells you about discrepancy in how people are remembered and who they actually were, to borrow from Ranke. And so first I look at cultural texts, created very close reading or critical overview of the cultural texts created after the famine. And I noticed that there are three modalities in describing rank and file perpetrators. Usually it is embraced agency or embraced modality, when we are talking about true believers, zealots, fanatics who believe in the greater necessity of the victims for the greater good, and they are willing to sacrifice, and they are unflinching Bolsheviks. And that's usually how they are portrayed in Soviet Ukrainian novels, as well as by the perpetrators themselves in their memoirs, like Lev Kopelev. That's how he describes himself, which is not unusual for perpetrators of other genocides and mass violence to describe themselves as, because you have to make sense of the past and traumatic past. Then there is modality in cultural memory to describe them as the other, so displaced agency. And usually it's in the novels created in Ukrainian diaspora and post-Soviet Ukrainian prose, poetry, drama. So they are ethnically different, they are Russians, they are Jewish, they don't belong to Ukrainian traditional society, and they are just the outcasts. And that's what dominates actually Ukrainian novel today. And finally, there is not so numerous, but there is this modality in novels to describe them more nuanced perpetrators, as perpetrators of any mass violence, as anywhere in the world, and Ukraine here is no different. And usually it's the novels in Sam Vedov or Tam Vedov, and Vasily Grossman is more popular, more better known authors who describe them as ordinary people and acting out of very banal motives, and their motivation is no different to the perpetrators of other cases of mass violence. And finally, in my other part of this chapter and my doctoral work, I look more in detail into what Kopelev actually, and people like Kopelev, did in the countryside in 1932-33. And I employed both qualitative and quantitative analysis by analyzing demographics, reports, intelligence, as well as I'm going into private archives, different level archives, and just trace these perpetrators, what happened to them after the famine, what happened to them during the famine, and who they were before the famine. And I come to the conclusion that they were ordinary people, majority of them were, which is, there is no incongruity between that data and data on the Holocaust perpetrators and perpetrators of other cases of mass atrocities, which leads us to the natural conclusion that there is burden of the past in memory of the Holodomor, how people who perpetrated, facilitated collectivization and grain procurement were. So there is this burden. In cultural memory, it's resolved with poetic justice. All these perpetrators are somehow avenged. But in the real life, we see that there was no poetic justice, and cultural memory acts as a compensation for that in some respects. And just coming to terms with what happened and explaining it by distancing ourselves, especially in Ukraine, would help to understand how this famine was possible in the first place, as well as to bring it closer to the studies of other famines and cases of mass violence across the world. So it's just one of the first steps in the Holodomor studies to take it closer to the studies of other cases like the Holodomor. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you very much for that brief summary. Okay, so we move on to Matthew. So Matthew Pauly is Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University, and he is author of a book entitled Breaking the Tongue, Language, Education, and Power in Soviet Ukraine, 1923 to 34, published by University of Toronto Press in 2014. He's also the author of a series of essays and articles on early Soviet nationality policy and the intersection between national identity, education, and childhood in late imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. He's currently engaged in a book entitled City of Children, Juvenile Poverty, Crime, and Salvation in Odessa. And Matthew's section in The Burden of the Past is on Simon Petlura. Its full title is Simon Petlura, The People's Republic and National Commemoration in Contemporary Ukraine. So it's my pleasure to now turn the floor over to Matt.
All right, Dobry den. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Yes. Thank you very much, Olenka, for that kind introduction, and to Anna for organizing this discussion. So my title's a little bit less sexy than Daria's, but I hope I intrigue you with some of the content. So indeed, my essay centers on the debate surrounding the commemoration of Simon Petlura, the military and political leader of Ukraine from 1917 to 1921, at least of Ukraine's struggle for independence during that period. And it really looks at a conversation that happens in the Soviet press, right? So I read through a lot of publications from 2004 up until the present time. So calls in the Ukrainian press have argued that his memorialization is all the more necessary because of the war that Olenka referenced in her introductory comments, right? This war with separatists in the Donbass, which some authors see as analogous with Petlura's war with foreign aggressors, as he saw it, with Russia. But this plea that has emerged since 2014 did not emerge suddenly. It has a longer history. It began with a long campaign for commemoration that one could say predated the demise of the Soviet Union, but really began with some urgency in 2005 under President Viktor Yushchenko. And in the post-Soviet environment, one would expect that this campaign for commemoration would have gotten a fair amount of life, right? That this would have been a much easier task than it has turned out to be. He's accused of two principal crimes by those who argue against his commemoration, that is responsibility in the anti-Jewish pogroms of 1919 and the forfeiture of Western Ukraine to Poland in the Treaty of Warsaw of 1920. So those who advocate for his commemoration have found it difficult to overcome these two principal charges, to be sure. But what I try to argue in this essay is their task is made all that more complicated by a vilification of Petlura that the Soviets waged against his memory that was premised on an amplification of these charges. And it's something that I had an opportunity to engage in with my own work. So I'm not necessarily a specialist of the Ukrainian Revolution or indeed the memory politics of the post-Soviet period. My specialty, as Olenka referenced in my first book, was on this period of Ukrainizatsiya, the Soviet promotion of Ukrainian culture, but also Soviet repression against Ukrainian intellectuals of that time, and many of whom were former adherents of the Petlura cause. And I was struck by my reading in the archives of a constant reference to Petlura. Right? Petlura becomes a stand-in for Ukrainian separatism, Ukrainian nationalism, and anybody who is tempted by that call is labeled a Petlura. So this is what intrigued me about Petlura, and why I thought I needed to write something about his memory. And the way that the Soviets used his memory to constrain what their ambitions were, or to focus what their ambitions were in Soviet Ukraine. So construction of national myths requires the absence of complexity, right? And whenever we're engaged in memory discussion and discussion of the construction of heroes, that's a very difficult thing to do, right? To do away with complexity. And yet that's what almost those who advocate for his restoration would suggest, right? The absence of complexity. So I'm a historian, and I spend some time in my essay trying to address the historical debate around Petlura, but I argue that the view of historians like me and my colleagues who are much more well-versed in the minutiae of Petlura's life, these discussions matter less than the public perception. Although there was some discussion, as I've already suggested, about Petlura before Yushchenko, it does not begin in earnest until his presidency. And in a curious twist of history, I suggest the campaign really began on May 25th, 2006, with a requiem held for Petlura at St. Vladimir's in Kyiv on the anniversary of his 1926 assassination in Paris by Shalom Schwarzbard, a Ukrainian Jew claiming revenge for the victims of the pogrom. I suggest that this event created recreated an event that probably never took place, but some Ukrainians undoubtedly believe should have. A secret requiem for Petlura held after his assassination in the year 1926 in St. Sophia's. So I went through, for my previous work, interrogation files for those arrested for membership in a fabricated nationalist organization called Union for Liberation of Ukraine, and this requiem was constantly referenced in their confessions. And there's no evidence that it actually ever happened, but I think it's a strange sort of parallel, right? That there is a requiem that happens in 2006 that is a mimicry of what the Soviet security services suggested had happened as a way of arguing that there were Ukrainian nationalists underground in Soviet Ukraine working against the aims of the Soviet state. So I center my discussion around debates in the press, as I've suggested, regarding attempts at public commemoration, particularly in Petlura's birthplace of Poltava. I'll condense my comments here, but essentially Poltava is an interesting place to talk about Petlura because of the particular contemporary politics in Poltava, particularly in the Yushchenko time, when there's a governor appointed by Yushchenko who's interested in promoting commemoration of Petlura, and a city council that really doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And they all have to contend with a long-standing Soviet association of Petlura with Ivan Mazepa, the Ukrainian Cossack leader who had led a struggle for autonomy for Ukraine against Russia and is defeated in the Battle of Poltava by Peter I. So the elevation of Petlura would require dealing with that association, as well as the demotion or disappearance with the Soviet narrative of who Petlura was particularly regarding issues of the naming of streets in Poltava and the like. Many of those streets in Poltava were associated with people that Petlura had fought against. So I would suggest, as I do in my essay, that those who rallied against commemoration of Petlura did not really create new charges or unearth new information, but they rehashed an old Soviet polemic with the hope that some of their charges would stick because these things existed in the public memory. I'll conclude, I know my time's short, by simply saying that by and large, attempts to honor Petlura disappear under Yanukovych, and then they reemerge after the Revolution of Dignity, as I've already suggested. There have been streets, including a very prominent one in Kyiv named after Petlura. There have been memorial plaques as well as murals installed in commemoration of Petlura, but there are long-standing projects for very large public works of art to honor Petlura that still have not reached fruition. And one has to step back and consider why. Petlura has re-entered the public debate because of two movies, The Secret Diary of Simon Petlura and Kruti 1918. I can talk about these if people are interested. But I look in the essay at reviews of these films. It's not my job, I think, to dissect just how much these things are historically accurate. I'm really interested in how Ukrainians have written about these films and the way they have to deal with public memory in their of Petlura in their commentary about the films. And what's interesting to me is that those on either side of the memory debate about Petlura, many of them come out and say, well, this is particularly The Secret Diary of Petlura is an unsatisfactory film because it's too simplistic, right? That the Ukrainian audience is more sophisticated than the film would would believe them to be. And that suggests something to me, to return back to my original point about the construction of heroes, right? That the construction of heroes requires a sort of suspension of disbelief, which is difficult to achieve under any circumstances, and is still difficult to achieve in the 21st century. And my chief argument is that with Petlura, this was always difficult because of a Soviet afterlife, a kind of Soviet ghost of Petlura that lingers on, that complicates and cannot be fully effaced. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our fourth speaker. And our fourth speaker is Olesya Khromeychuk. And Olesya is a teaching fellow in modern European history at King's College London. And her research focuses on the participation of women in military formations during Second World War and in the ongoing conflict in the Donbas region of Ukraine. She is the author of Undetermined Ukrainians, Post-War Narratives of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division, which came out in 2013. Olesya has contributed a piece to our volume, The Burden of the Fat, or I have just appropriated the volume, but to the volume, The Burden of the Past, that is entitled Glory to the Heroes, Gender, Nationalism, and Memory. So Olesya, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Olenka, and thank you so much for organizing this discussion and having me been part of it. It's an honor. Also, many thanks to the editors, Anna and Małgorzata. I know you've gone through quite a lot of hurdles and obstacles to get this volume published. The chapters were written back in 2015-16, right? And it's amazing that you managed to do it. Also, I'd like to point out that it's really refreshing and it's a joy really to see so many pieces contributed by women scholars, something that isn't necessarily, a rule when we talk about the war in particular and difficult aspects of history, in particular war history. So thanks for that. Now, about my chapter. So I tried to analyze gendered aspects of commemorative practices prevalent in the last few years in Ukraine. I focus mostly on commemoration of the nationalist movement, in particular the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and how these gendered aspects are portrayed in historiography, but also in state-endorsed initiatives, in particular by the Institute of National Memory. Why gender? Well, because when we talk about the construction of gender roles, especially in commemorative practices, we talk about the representation of experience of people who tend to be left out from the narrative of wars, women in particular, right? When they are included, they usually included as symbols of victimhood or symbols of the nation. So it's important to study how they have been included and what these messages say, really. Another reason why I think it's really important to focus on gender is because this sort of perspective allows us to move away from the trap in which controversial organizations such as OUN and UPA get stuck in, and that's the trap of the dichotomy of heroes and villains, right? So what this perspective allows us to do is to problematize the very notion of a hero as a military man. So, you know, defender of the nation who's usually a military man is by default perceived as a hero, right? So gender-sensitive approach allows us to problematize that portrayal, and instead allows us to look at the reality of people's experiences of warfare, in this particular case, nationalist underground, men and women, right? Allows us to look at power structures in these organizations, which is very important. Allows us to look at different aspects of ideology and how they affected the membership of these organizations, but also people who came into contact with them. And finally, it's important to talk about gendered aspects of commemorative practices, because as we all know, the way we remember the past tells us more about us, the present, than it tells us about the past, right? So the way that gender roles are constructed in commemorative work tells us how this, well, in my case, the state, because I've been tracing mostly kind of state-endorsed initiatives, how the state wants us to perceive gender roles today. Yeah, and that has an immediate effect on the perception of the war in Eastern Ukraine that is ongoing at the moment, the war in Donbass. And I'll come back to that hopefully later on. My argument is really quite simple. What I'm trying to say in this chapter is that in theory, usually the way we perceive wars, gender roles in wars is very sort of rigid. You know, men go to fight, women stay and contribute to the home front. In practice, war zone is a space where gender roles get negotiated, and where gender roles are very complex, actually. So on the other hand, if we study commemoration, remembering of wars, we notice that everything gets really simplified. And in fact, the gender roles that are presented in commemorative work are usually quite rigid, a lot more than they were in actual fact, in reality, during the war, right? So let's take the example of the OUN and UPA very briefly, and that's what I mostly look at in the chapter. These were highly patriarchal organizations. Their perception of gender roles was very traditional. So, you know, there are men who are supposed to defend motherland and they're women. And then there are women who are supposed to raise sons who would then defend motherland and they're women, right? So that was their kind of official stance. In reality, both of these organizations really depended on their female membership. Women did all sorts of roles. Mostly they were involved in so-called traditional feminine roles, which you know, mostly involved in sort of medical care, other caring duties, provision of food, and so on. But they were vital for reconnaissance, for liaison, for propaganda work, and so on. So in other words, women were useful to these organizations as women, specifically because of the traditional position of gender roles. So men were seen as suspect because of their gender and had to go underground, or else they might be arrested, whereas women were perceived in that society at the time as apolitical, at least for some time, and therefore incapable of active engagement in these organizations. And so they could maintain legal or semi-legal status and be invaluable to these clandestine organizations, right? So that's a really important thing to remember. That's not to say that their input was perceived as highly valuable. They were still and continue to be perceived and still continue to be perceived as supportive force. The women are the ones who support the actual nationalists. So very briefly, how are they being remembered? How have they been remembered in the last few years in Ukraine? Well, they either aren't remembered at all, so they are not included in the heroic canon, in the kind of pantheon of nationalist heroes, although that's changing a little bit. And if they are included, they're usually included as forgotten heroines, right? So they are added to the established male-centric, heroic, celebratory canon. And that means they don't challenge this pantheon at all. If anything, their inclusion endorses this pantheon. Okay, so if we think about exhibitions and other projects that have looked at participation of women in the nationalist movement that have been prepared, in the last few years, especially by the Institute of National Memory, we will see that the presentation of these women is a sort of, they're being showcased as heroines. And the message is even women joined this movement and took up arms in order to secure independence of Ukraine. Right. So I'm going to conclude now with the couple of observations that I feel are important for me to raise in relation to this chapter. This type of commemoration does a number of things. Like I said before, it endorses the already existing celebratory kind of approach to nationalist movement. It does not add anything to the debate. It does not discuss the patriarchal nature of these organizations that we're talking about, the reality of women's experience, which included discrimination, which included gender-based violence, which included sexual violence, not only from the enemy, but also from their fellow nationalist insurgents. It does not, and that's really important for me, it does not raise the question of how we should discuss participation of women in violence, including terrorist acts. And this participation is very complex because on the one hand, it's active and in some cases even empowering, at least for the duration of the conflict. But on the other hand, it is instrumentalized and it is conditioned by the masculinist setting in which these women function, right? So this discussion is extremely difficult. It's one thing to say these women were there and add them to the pantheon. It's another thing to say, well, what does it mean that they were there? How are we to understand their, the fact that they were part of everything that these organizations took part in? Okay, and finally, again, this is, I believe, particularly important for us to analyze the involvement of women and how they are written into commemorative practices, is that they are being presented as role models for contemporary women and contemporary society. So the Ukrainian state, since the war in Donbass started in particular, the Ukrainian state has been trying to kind of create this sort of presentation of the different wars as one continuum, as one kind of continuous struggle of Ukrainians for independence. I mean, sometimes it goes as far back as the Cossacks. More recently, the focus has been on the last 100 years. So starting with Krute, kind of glorious defeat, Ukrainian revolution, going through the Second World War, mostly focusing on the nationalist movement, occasionally touching the Red Army, and on to the present day. And so historical figures, men and women, that are being picked for this purpose are supposed to serve as role models for contemporary service men and women, right? And that's why it's really important to trace how the women are being presented. Because I'll be happy to talk about this in Q&A, but just briefly to mention, service women right from the start of the conflict in Donbass have been in an extremely precarious position. That position is being regularized now a bit more, but it's still quite precarious. And their representation today is really reminiscent of the representation of historical servicewomen, so nationalists and those in other organizations. So we need to keep an eye on how that develops. And very finally, Olenka will be pleased to know what I'm trying to say is remembering the reality of women's experiences in the nationalist movement will give us a critical lens through which we can analyze women's involvement in nationalist movements today, but also women's involvement in wars more generally, including the one in Donbass. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Olesya. It's clear how passionate you are about your research. So thank you very much. So what I would like to do now is begin the Q&A question. And what I'll do is, so please send in your questions, but what I'll do is I will begin by asking each panelist a question. And if we could all just keep track of time, including myself. So but first question goes to our first panelist, Anna. And Anna, I found your essay extremely enlightening, especially and maybe a little shocking in terms of the general lack of knowledge and interest in Żochwa's past among the town's current inhabitants. So thank you very much for conducting this research and bringing it to my attention. So you conclude your essay on a reassuring note, and you say that the Żochwian memory of historic Polishness is not yet irreversibly lost, but depends on the evolution of Ukrainian remembrance policy at the central level. So my question to you is twofold. First, shouldn't remembrance be a more integral part of today's society rather than a top-down authoritarian exercise? And second, it's my understanding that from its earliest times, Żochwa was a multi-ethnic town populated by Poles, Armenians, Ukrainians, Jews. So should it be the Polishness of Żochwa rather than its multi-ethnic past that should be commemorated for future generations?
Yeah, I will maybe start with a comment to what you said at the beginning. I would say that in general, people, like average, ordinary people, do not care about the past. We care about, we historians, sociologists, anthropologists, think memory studies and so on, we care about the past and about the way people deal with their past. But usually people are much more interested in what's happening now in their town and than in what happened 50 or 70 or 80 years ago. And I didn't mention it, but that was not a research devoted entirely to Polishness of Żochwa and also not entirely to Żochwa. That was part of my also doctoral research, and that was a comparison of two small towns, one in Poland and one in Ukraine, which lost most of its populations during the war and gained new population. And I was interested in how these people who came to these towns remember the past that they did not experience, in fact, because they were not there, meaning that a considerable part of today inhabitants of Żochwa's Ukrainians came from contemporary Poland, deported after the war. So these are not only local Ukrainians, but also Ukrainians from Poland and also Ukrainians from Central and Eastern Ukraine who came to Żochwa after 1945. And interesting question is how they remember collectively, somehow socially, the past they never experienced. And as starting my answer from your second question, of course, I don't think Polishness is somehow, should be somehow privileged in being commemorated, but the fact is that Polishness means not only Poles who used to be there and are not there anymore, but also Polish state, Polish culture, and Polish oppression and Polish rule. This is how it's perceived by most of the Ukrainians living now in Żochwa. So somehow it's unique, although it does not mean that it should be that Polish victims or Poles living there should be somehow especially commemorated. And in fact, they are not. If anyone is commemorated, except of the ethnic Ukrainians in today's Żłobka, these are the Jewish victims. I mean, I don't envy Jewish victims being commemorated, but the fact is that something happened in commemorating the Holocaust, and this is also maybe a start for my answer for the first question that was asked in this chat box. I'm just wondering, should I answer it now, because it's somehow linked with what you're asking. Yeah, so the question was...
Sorry.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was, of course, also interested in what's happening concerning the memory of the Holocaust and the memory of how the Jews vanished from Żłobka and how this is commemorated. And the time when I first arrived in Żłobka, there was a monument, and that's also a part of the answer to the question that was asked by Alan Flowers. So there was a monument built in the end of 90s outside Żłobka, in the very place where most of the Żłobka Jews were executed in 1943. So that was the place of the mass grave, and there was a monument built on the initiative of the last Jewish survivor who remained in Żłobka after the war, and with the financial support of the Jews of the Jews not living now in Żłobka, but who had some ancestors there. So there was this monument, but it was vandalized a few years after it was built. And then it seemed that not that much happened. But recently, Żłobka became part of the project conducted by Ukrainian Center for Holocaust Research from Kiev, Ukraiński Centrum Wywczenia Holokaustu. And they came with the initiative of building a memorial plaque on the place where before the war the Jewish cemetery was located. Now it's open air market, as in many other places like that. So there's a plaque saying that there used to be a Jewish cemetery and that another part of the Żłobka's Jews were shot there. So I would say that if anything happens in commemorating people of other ethnicity than Ukrainians, it's happening within the field of the Holocaust commemoration and not, cultivating the Polishness or the Polish past of the town. Maybe the main difference between commemorating the Polishness and the Jewishness of the historical Żłobka is the fact that small but kind of distinct Polish minority still exists in Żłobka. They have their church, so there's a Polish Catholic church. Poles from Poland are coming to Żłobka, so they're kind of visible to the local inhabitants. But I wouldn't say that anything is going to happen within this field. And also answering the other part of the question that was asked, I would say that Lviv should be not perceived as the same. Well, Lviv is not the rest of Western Ukraine, as Warsaw is not the same as the rest of Poland. So if we see that many things, interesting things in the field of the Holocaust commemoration are happening in Lviv, it does not mean that it's going to happen in smaller places. Żłobka is a small town, and although, I mean, not offending Żłobka because I spent a lot of time there, there is currently, I would say, no space and no resources, first and foremost, to maintain this kind of activities in the field of Holocaust commemoration as in Lviv. And the very fact that the plaque was built is really a great success for me that I didn't expect. And I mean, it's really exceptional and good that it happened. So it's not that nothing is happening, but we should keep in mind the scale of what can happen in Lviv and can happen in small places as Żłobka.
Thank you, Anna. If it's okay, we'll move on and I'll ask Daria a question, and then we can come back to questions and continue on Żłobka, which I think also is a great town, and I'd love to ask questions about the architecture. So, Daria. Okay, so I think, thank you for bringing very fresh evidence and a new perspective on the trauma of Holodomor to our attention. My question, which you sort of partially answered in your little introduction of your work, is that it refers to your title. So your title, Idle, Drunk, and Good for Nothing, is catchy, but is it fair? So when I read your piece, I understood that this phrase really only refers to the non-wealthy, the committees of non-wealthy peasants that you identify as one group among the perpetrators. And this seems to extend these characteristics to all of the perpetrators. And I feel like, in fact, you're talking about the opposite, the sort of nuances among perpetrators. So that's one part of the question. And the second part is, as you discuss these perpetrators, the perpetrator-victim line becomes blurry, right? And I was wondering what your thoughts are about the fact that about this sort of inability to then distinguish, or this, what in fact happens with your research is this blurring of victim and perpetrator, and how that affects national memory, or what effect that would have on national memory.
Thank you, Olenka, and thank you for the introduction and the organizing this discussion as well. Yes, that title is misleading in terms of I'm dispelling that myth of them as being outcasts of the village. And I tried to show in the chapter that it was people of all walks of life, and you can tell that by demographics that they were not necessarily Jewish, Russian, or coming from the cities. Majority of them were local. And as you said, there are these lines between these two groups, perpetrators and victims, are blurred. And in my research, I went to two villages. I used microhistory approach. And when I interviewed victims, I realized that their family history is sometimes so intertwined with the perpetrators. And in presence of some family members, they are telling me a completely different story to what they are telling me otherwise in private. So indeed, and that's actually answers the question by Alan Flowers in the messages about how it is remembered in Western Ukraine, which was not affected by the Holodomor. And it is related. It's in a way that now we have very few people who survived the Holodomor and remembers the Holodomor left. And when we look at their testimonies and survivor testimonies, we see that they provide a more nuanced approach how they remember. Sometimes they call them idle drunks and just the idol of the village. But nevertheless, when we apply quantitative approach, we see that it is ordinary people. Yet in cultural memory, in novels in particular, we see this prevailing modality of displaced, of idle, drunk, and good for nothing. And it dominates the Western Ukraine as well, because it is included in school curriculum, it is on TV, in films, and even the Museum of the Holodomor, in their exposition, they include this cliched representation of the perpetrators. So I hope I did answer your question to that. So yes, it is just to catch the attention of the reader, really.
Good job. Oh, sorry. Good job. I don't know if my microphone is on. Is it on? Yes.
It is.
Okay. Okay, so I will now ask Matthew a question. So Matthew, I thought your essay was excellent in the clear and succinct way it portrayed Petlura and his importance in Ukrainian history and Ukraine's short-lived independence from 1918 to 21. So what you make clear is that in order to understand Petlura, we require a nuanced approach to him. And you imply that the first such steps, or state that the first such steps have been taken in publications and in films. But you also, as you did in your short presentation, remind us that construction of national myths require clarity, and therefore blames or accolades are usually showered upon heroes or villains, right? So you end your introduction by asking your readers to contemplate if Ukraine needs heroes and if the heroes must be anti-Russian. So my question to you is, are these rhetorical questions? Or if you can indeed imagine Ukraine moving away from this unrealistic expectations of hero worship. And also in the current situation of war with Russia, can pro-Ukrainian ever be completely devoid of anti-Russian?
In a way, I would certainly say the rhetorical question. I don't have a complete and comprehensive response to that. I would just say, as somebody who entered into the profession knowing no Ukrainian, right, studying Russian for much of my collegiate and beginning of my graduate career, and then coming to Ukrainian midway through my graduate career. When one begins to study Ukrainian, you become fascinated with all aspects of Ukrainian culture, history, and language, and you want to learn more. And people like me struggled to find as much as I wanted about Petlura and others. So I always find myself highly sympathetic with the search for heroes, right? Particularly given the constraints of public discussion within Soviet Ukraine. That being said, Petlura himself, as I hope I convincingly argued, is not such a person to center one's hero construction around, although I deeply understand the search to do so. I don't know. Probably I'll defer to those who might be able to say a bit more, who are deeply engaged in this discussion of what public memory means across multiple spaces. I would just say it's a common sort of thing. And I've always held the opinion that, when one compares heroes of the Irish Republic or something along those lines, Ukraine comes to a period of independence in a time when complexity is demanded by, it's just not an easy thing to oversimplify, right? We have a remarkably politically and historically literate population, even if, as Anna rightly notes, they care less about history as people who like us who make their profession writing history. Nevertheless, you can't just simply peel away everything to its essential core and present an uncomplicated hero. In regards to whether the Ukrainian struggle will always be anti-Russian, I sure hope not. Ukraine has a fundamentally long historical relationship with Russia. Its future depends on a relationship with Russia, but it is difficult to conceive of that presently, when it's most certain that Russia's involved in the supply of those who would constrain Ukraine's full embrace of its territorial sovereignty. So in the present environment, it's difficult to see how some sort of, how this search for heroes doesn't involve a reflection of the present, which is fundamentally suspicious of Russia's present aims and Russia's historical aims in the past.
Thank you very much. And my last question is for Olesya Khromeychuk. And Olesya, I think your work makes it very clear that there is a lack of critical engagement with gender in discussing the Ukrainian nationalist narratives, and especially that this carries significant consequences for the future. So my question is whether this lack of gender equality and these fixed definitions of masculinity and femininity are somehow specific to nationalist narratives in Ukraine, or do they extend beyond these nationalist narratives? And then in trying to deconstruct them, I'm wondering if you could tell us about available sources or research that can be used to mitigate these propagated gender notions about women in the OUN and UPA. So basically, what are the sources that young researchers could go to or look for? And my final question would be, how does this compare these gender issues or handling of gender issues in Ukrainian nationalist narratives with those of other European states? Is it a similar, is there a similar sort of disregard or continuity of established notions of gender that we could perceive in other European nationalist narratives?
Thank you so much, Olenka. Such important questions. Might be tricky to address them without writing another paper, at least, or maybe three.
That's encouraging. Another book from all of you.
But this is very important to think about them. So whether the first question was whether it's specific to nationalist narratives. No, I don't think so. So in the research I do at the moment, I compare the second, so participation of women in the Second World War in the Red Army and in UPA. And also I use examples from other military organizations, paramilitary organizations too, but those are the major two case studies. And to be honest, in spite of all the differences that you can imagine between those two military formations, the way that women experienced war and the way that they were represented in post-war memory is very similar. And the way they tell the stories, so when I interview these women, I interviewed women who were part of the nationalist movement and interviewed women who were Red Army veterans, the way they tell their stories, the way they belittle their experience and say, well, no, that's not important. What I experienced, I'll tell you the official narrative that's out there that's already, you know, become the canon is really, really similar. Or the way that they are reluctant to talk about gender-based violence, and so on and so forth, the taboos that exist. So no, I don't think it's specific to nationalism as such. What it is, I think, specific to is the context of war and the context of the military, of militarized society. And that's why I also compare the findings from my research from the Second World War with what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. And when I interview some of the women that have taken part in the conflict in Donbass, I often ask them the same questions I asked the veterans of the Second World War. And sadly, I get very similar answers. But I think the specificity of the nationalist question is in that the way that it was presented, especially by the OUN, was that, you know, nation is above all. So, you know, nation is the ultimate goal, and therefore all other individual freedoms have to be put aside or forgotten, at least for the duration of the conflict. And that's when gender analysis is very important, because the consequences for men and women who participate in this project are different. So, once the conflict is over and this kind of nationalist project is being built, where is the space, where is the place for women in this project? And the place of women is often relegated to the domestic and kind of, they're being excluded from it. So in that sense, I think it's important to look at nationalism separately, but also in comparison with other ideological sort of, other military formations of other ideologies, right? Sources. Quite luckily, quite a lot of women are still alive, sadly fewer and fewer. I was lucky to still interview quite a few. I know Marta Havryshko, a fantastic scholar who might or might not be among the participants here, the attendees here, have interviewed over 60 women, and she's collected an amazing database of these interviews and published some of those interviews already. So it's still possible to reach out to survivors of the Second World War, to veterans. And also we are extremely lucky that unlike the Russian archives, Ukrainian archives of that period, especially Secret Services archives, are open. And accessible. I mean, they're not the easiest to use. I think all of us have used them, but you can use them. You can get access to them. You are able to even request files from abroad and they will email them to you. Maybe not all that you've requested, but some. So the sources are there. So if we're talking about the studying of the actual experience of the Second World War and the gendered aspects, of course, we need to read these sources between the lines. I mean, they don't tell us necessarily everything, openly. We need to have our gender-sensitive glasses on when we read them, but they are there. And the program documents of these organizations are mostly available, often available online. So I don't think there's a lack of sources necessarily. And of course, if we're studying the memory of these organizations, then, if you travel to Ukraine, you see how they've been commemorated. In fact, you don't need to travel to Ukraine. If you look at the work of the Institute of National Memory, at least until recently, it's all out there, online. You can see it. You can see their projects. Their exhibitions are usually also available online. How does it compare with other European states? I think I partly possibly answered that, often when you look at the experience of women during the war, some of the experiences are so similar that you begin to wonder how it's possible for people to function in such different periods, even not to mention this, just the Second World War. But you look at you look at participation in revolutions or any other sort of experience political violence. It's fascinating how similar, how gender shapes women's experiences, right? How gender shapes their experiences. So, but without taking too much time, maybe I'll just pause there for now.
Okay, so I know that we've gone over time, but I'm going to give us 10 more minutes to address some of the questions coming in. So there's a question from Lilia Berezhnaya, and she's saying, thank you all for this interesting presentation. My rather general question refers to the role of the Ukrainian churches in constructing contemporary narratives about traumatic experiences of the 20th century. It applies both to the Polish heritage in Żłóchwa, as well as the remembrance of Holodomor or other themes touched upon in this discussion. Do we see any differences or commonalities? Thanks a lot. So basically the question is to everyone, and the question is the impact of the church on commemorative practices in Ukraine with regards to traumatic events of the past. Have any of you looked at the involvement of the church in these commemorative practices?
Well, I can start if nobody else is willing to start. Well, definitely I was looking at the role of the church and churches in Żłóchwa, because at the time when I was starting my research, there were three, two Orthodox and one Greek Catholic church in Żłóchwa, and the Roman Catholic Church. So in fact, 4 churches actively active in Żovko, and they were all really active in what was happening in the field of commemoration. And I would say that at least in the 90s and in the first decade of the 2000s, the local priest had the leading role in what was commemorated and what was not. And as far as I know, the local priest was not present at the ceremony when the Jewish monument was built and people came to see it and so on. But everything what happened was possible because the local churches allowed for it and encouraged it or not. So also I would say that it's always that the local community commemorates what it needs to be commemorated for some reasons. And if we look at Żovkva in the 90s, we see that the first, like the really important commemoration was the monument rebuilt somehow, not built, but rebuilt and renovated in the very center of the town, commemorating the NKVD victims of the 1941, because these were our victims. These people were considered our victims that were silenced. Their suffering was silenced during the Soviet period, and once it was possible, once the commemoration was possible, they were commemorated because they deserved it. And after that, there was a line of other victims, and some of these victims were commemorated, some were not. But this first commemoration was possible also because of the participation of the church. So I would say that especially, I don't know much about how it was happening in other parts of Ukraine, but at least in Western Ukraine, the approval of the local priest was crucial for what was happening. And I would also, just to bring the comparison, I would say that it's not much different in small localities in Poland. The priest is also very important.
I would like to address that issue as well. In the Holodomor, the role of church was really important right from the beginning of collectivization, when the churches were closed down and they could not offer any support to the for obvious reasons. They could not, they were closed, and the priests were repressed. So the starving population was also denied even that role of church. But later on in the late 1980s, when public commemoration was already allowed to some extent, we can see erection of obviously churches and crosses to commemorate the places of mass burial of the victims. So here church comes to the prominent place, and as well as the commemorative practices themselves. It's commemorative to remember the victims with the candle in third Saturday of November, and in the museum practice, yes, we see the church coming featuring prominently, and hence I would agree that the churches, the Ukrainian churches, played a crucial role in commemoration of the Holodomor as well.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't know if we want to get in another question, or should we continue along these lines?
We have one final question, but I thought, Matt, do you want to talk about the Jura and the? I know you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it several times in the essay, the role that that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the former Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarchate, played in commemoration of Petlora. Indeed, in my formal comments that I made here, right, I focus on this issue of the Requiem. I would like to write even more about that. I just don't know enough, but I do think it is interesting that what I view as a really concerted campaign to commemorate Petlora begins in St. Volodymyr's in, as I suggested, in mimicry of something that probably never happened, and yet for adherents to the Ukrainian People's Republic and to Petlora's cause. It should have happened, and if it didn't, let's make sure it happens in the age of an independent Ukraine. I also talk briefly about Mazepa's excommunication, and there's an inference in the Ukrainian press that the Soviet security services are kind of like high priests, right? Also excommunicating Petlora's adherents from the Soviet Ukrainian body politic, but also from, I mean, there's a metaphor of the church that features in the background. It would be very interesting to learn what the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, has to say about all this, and I frankly don't know, but I'll go finding now. I'll go looking, and hopefully we'll find some information about that. But it prompts me to think even deeper about the way in which this public memory is maintained outside of churches that one would expect would be neatly keepers of Petlora's memory and the memory of the autocephalous Ukrainian church with which he was associated.
Thank you. We have a final question from an anonymous attendee, which is broad, and maybe all of you can just conjure up, put together your thoughts to answer this question, but here it goes. How can we create awareness of different realities in memory among individuals or communities, especially across borders? And more importantly, how can we assure implementation of these different realities in the associated societies?
By disseminating research like this.
If I may say something, I was thinking about that in the context, as an art historian, I was thinking about this in the context of the Petlura monument, the Zhokva, the architecture in Zhokva, and and I think, Matthew, you talk about this in your piece as well, and I feel that the built environment can play a big role in keeping these memories alive in a way that isn't sort of a forced commemoration. But I think the issue would have to be that the monuments that are planned for these type of commemorative purposes can't be, reproductions of socialist monuments and hero worship, but actually have to be thought about carefully in light of such discussions. So, I keep thinking of cemeteries that have hundreds of crosses, which bring to mind the loss that such traumatic events caused, as opposed to necessarily monuments to heroes. But this is just in thinking about, when I read your all of your papers, these were thoughts that came to mind, to keep a built environment that shows diversity, and to think about commemoration on a level that is part of the everyday environment. But if anyone has any thoughts. Olesya.
There was also a comment in the chat. I don't know if it's visible to all, that sort of juxtaposes or maybe combines the toppling of monuments and during the Black Lives Matter movement and decommunization, which is not irrelevant to the question that you brought up. And to be honest, I was slightly taken aback by some of the reaction that I saw of the Ukrainian community to this, critical reaction, sort of saying, no, bring monuments down, it's part of history, rather than seeing the process of toppling monuments as part of history too, given that, we lost hopefully all of our Lenins now, I think, in Ukraine, as far as I understand. But this is also an opportunity to think of how we want to fill our public spaces. We don't have that much space to fill it with. Do we really want men on horses necessarily in military gear? What does it say about our society? And the pandemic made us think, I think, also differently about the heroes, nurses, drivers, often ethnic minority, representative communities of ethnic minorities, people who are very badly paid, who had to risk their lives while we were being safe at home, you know, they are started to be perceived as heroes. So maybe we can reconsider our notion of heroes. And the same applies to Ukraine, and not just in relation to pandemic, but also to the war. If we must, have heroes in the context of war, then maybe for Ukrainians, it's important to rethink how we talk about volunteer movement. Again, it's usually women, again, it's usually unsung heroes, the helpers. But if you really think about what they did from the start of the war in Donbass, they replaced the state. So if we talk about them in a specific way, we then complicate the discussion. We ask, well, what was wrong with the state? What was wrong with the army? Why civilians had to step in? And it creates this kind of idea of civic identity, Ukrainian civic identity, not exclusionary, but actually quite inclusive. So I do think that these moments of crises are the opportunities for us to rethink of what heroes mean.
I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I know we're short of time, so I would just say, since you referenced my essay, I mean, there's a particularly curious moment in the essay about the statue of Mikola Schwartz that I'm sure everybody knows about if you've spent any time in Kyiv. When I started studying Ukrainian at Taras Shevchenko University, I had no idea who this guy was. And now he's disappeared from his horseback, and just his feet remain, right, stuck on the horse, and it's been camouflaged, is my understanding. I haven't been back to Kyiv recently, but so that would suggest a toppling of the Soviet iconostasis in a way, and your question quite rightly asks us what should replace it, and I don't have a succinct answer to that beyond just as more as I try to talk about Piloara to my family. I'm stuck with my family right now on vacation in Southwest Michigan, and trying to explain who this is. And I say, you know, he's kind of like the George Washington of Ukraine. Maybe that's a problematic analogy, but it's something that my parents can understand. And George Washington is, of course, a deeply, deeply flawed hero of the revolution. And the monument in DC is something that is not particularly associated with his person, I would suggest, maybe something associated with his ideas, and, you know, keeping with the spirit of civic monuments with which obelisks are associated. But I do think Lesya, I can't speak any better than Lesya. Lesya asks really provocative questions, and going beyond individuals, considering larger, who was it actually involved in the movements and sustained them, should be an inevitable part of a discussion of any public construction of public monuments. So I'll leave it there.
So I think this is a wonderful way to end our discussion of a fabulous contribution to scholarship, which, if nothing else, and it does much, but it really provokes thought, and I think significant thought about both the future and the past of Ukraine. And I think the one thing I'd like to reiterate once more is that many nations, as Lesya mentioned, and as we are bringing parallels in, face these same issues in terms of who it is that society should commemorate and how. And I think it behooves us to remember that Ukraine is trying to grapple with these issues while trying also to maintain its sovereignty, which is not at all as secure as it is for other states who have done not such a great job in dealing with these same issues. So again, I'd like to thank all four of you for giving me such a wonderful opportunity to purchase and read a new book, and opening my mind to so many topics and issues. I can't wait to travel to Poltava, to Zhokva, to visit my relatives who were in the UPA. And so thank you all very much, and congratulations on a job well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.